We brought down the temperatures considerably. Yesterday it was much hotter. If you came here by public transport, you maybe get an impression of how the weather was in Berlin during the last days. But now we'll cool down and we'll focus on a very interesting program for these 3 days. My name is Christoph Hamann. I'm head of the press department for BASE, and I would like to know if any one of you has been to safeND before. 2 years ago, we met for the very first time at Berlin Westhafen. Who's been there before? Welcome back. Thank you for coming again. I assume, and I'm quite sure you will enjoy this year's edition as well. This year, the topic will be resilience. Resilience, we do need resilience. We had a worldwide, a global crisis when it came to health terms, COVID. We have, unfortunately, a worldwide crisis due to military conflict. And by the way, let me explain to you, we had chosen this place called Café Moscow some time ago, and we did have several discussions if we should stick to this place due to the name. But we are fully convinced that from this place, resilience means we have to stick to peace and to negotiate and to talk to each other and avoid military conflicts. And I hope you share my opinion when it comes to that. And no matter how this place is called, it's Café Moscow. It has a great history. This is a place of formerly East Berlin. Over there you see the Keynote International, a very famous place for movies and for premieres. And Café Moscow has been a very well-known address here in this part of Berlin, East Berlin formerly as well. So once again, welcome to this year's conference, to the Symposium, and I hope you'll enjoy our full program of sessions, of panel discussions, of meetings. You will find all the rooms close in this vicinity. They are called Riga, they are called Bishkek, Ashgabat. You'll find your way, I'm sure, and be assured we'll also have some breaks. We'll have coffee, and we'll all have, in the evening, a program as well. What I'd like you to do is please wear your name tags, because then it makes it easier for my team to let you in and out of the building, and we see who really belongs here. So please wear your name tags and make yourself also familiar with the exit rooms. Here is or exit ways. Here is one, over there is one. And of course, with the program, choose well. There's a lot on offer for your information. Please go through the pages and see where you're going to end up, in which kind of panel or interesting discussion, where you would like to go. This year we have about 300 registrations. Most of them I'll see over here already from 15 nations, so we are quite proud of that. It took us a lot of work to organize this conference, and I would like you to clap your hands as well from our organizational team here in BASE. We did a lot to get you here and to establish this program. Thank you very much. This is an insight. Thank you very much. I would like you to give some applause to the team as well. I will introduce the people later on as well. Thank you. Now I would like to give the microphone, if you like, to our first distinguished guest. He's State Secretary for the Federal Ministry for the Environment. His seat is above, over there, not too far away. He came here early this morning. We're very happy to have him over here. And he will give his view and some introductory remarks on our this year's conference motto. Once again, welcome Stefan, Tidow. Please come on stage and deliver your speech. We'll be happy to hear from you. This way, that way. That's more dynamic. Yes, good morning. Thank you.
So, thank you, Christoph. Mr. Ahlswede, Mrs. Kaufhold, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Federal Environment Ministry, I would like to welcome you to the second safeND Symposium here at Café Moscow in Berlin. And dear BASE colleagues, thank you for inviting me to give an opening speech at this second interdisciplinary research symposium on safety of nuclear disposal practices of the Federal Office for the safety of nuclear waste management. It was a pleasure to accept, as it gives me the opportunity to personally express my appreciation to the research community. I'm very pleased and I'm impressed that you already mentioned approximately 300 national and international participants from science, from the Länder ministries here in Germany, and from civil society committees have to come together in your symposium to present and jointly discuss their research results and innovative ideas. I would to particularly welcome the many young scientists among you here today. You are the future of research. You, the junior scientists, will be building on what the researchers have achieved so far in the field of safety in nuclear waste management, and you will further shape it in the future and further development nuclear safety, particularly in final disposal. And supporting young talent is something what we at the Ministry for Nuclear Safety attach great importance to, and we are pleased to see that you are supporting us actively. Ladies and gentlemen, I think it is safe to say we have all learned a lot about nuclear safety challenges in recent years. Challenges with such intensity that we could not have imagined at the time of the commissions on the storage of high-level radioactive materials and the entry into force of the Site Selection Act in 2017. They were not only challenges for managing our everyday life and for your current research projects. The new circumstances have made it clear to us that the research agenda itself is affected. The question of final disposal is about anticipating scenarios. It is about thinking the previously unthinkable. It is about resilience. So, and we are now confronted with some new experience. We have all gone through a global pandemic. You as a research community has been directly affected. How can laboratories continue to operate under lockdown conditions? How can minimum distances be guaranteed when working together? Many of your experiments had to be stopped or experienced significant delays. I'm therefore all the more impressed by your passion to develop creative solutions to continue your research, even under the most difficult conditions. All of us, including the supervisory authorities and ministries, have developed and introduced very flexible and dynamic working methods. This development provides a sound basis for our upcoming challenges. I'm sure our research will benefit from it and become more diverse and interdisciplinary in future. For your resilience, endurance, and your innovative strengths, I would like to thank you most sincerely. However, we have also had to witness the military attack on Ukraine. We are all concerned about the threat to Ukraine nuclear power plants. Many of you have been directly affected by this, and the changed energy supply situation is still affecting all of us. You had to rethink your present projects, for example, by searching for other international partners in ongoing projects in order to be able to continue them successfully. But of course, we must also ask ourselves, are war, terror, and crisis scenarios sufficiently taken into account for the handling and disposal of radioactive waste? And what does this mean for nuclear safety in general? And above all is the ongoing climate change crisis. In the field of nuclear safety too, these changes are giving rise to a wide range of impacts. For instance, with regard to waste management, on the one hand, there is a question of whether we should expect different or more intense extreme weather conditions for the extended interim storage times and the period until the repository is closed. And on the other hand, we have the question of whether this could impact the safety of these nuclear facilities. So these examples illustrate how we have jointly lived up to our responsibility and continuously ensure they improve the safety of nuclear waste management in these fast-moving times of major change. Ladies and gentlemen, when I look at the agenda of this safeND Symposium, I can see what a wide range of topics you are working on in an interdisciplinary manner. They cover numerous scientific and engineering aspects of nuclear waste management and cover the spectrum from legal issues to public participation. With this wealth of topics and the recognizable interdisciplinary networking, I'm sure you are all aware of your responsibility to improve the safety of nuclear waste management and make it sustainable for the future. You are also aware of the importance of international cooperation, and I'm certain you make sure to prepare such complex topics for the different target groups in an understandable way. Therefore, at this safeND Symposium, communication and participation have been balanced equally with scientific and technical topics. Public acceptance of the issue of nuclear waste management is a common goal that we must never lose sight of. Bearing in mind our aim to communicate scientific knowledge well and comprehensively, we must always keep track to new developments and formats in order to be able to continue to reach the public in the best possible way. Ladies and gentlemen, Germany shut down its last remaining nuclear power plants on April 15th this year. Germany has phased out from the civilian use of nuclear energy. But there is no phase out of responsibility. The decommissioning of plants will occupy us for a long time to come. The dismantling, safe interim storage, and of course the final storage that will keep us busy for decades to come. Safeguards and non-proliferation also remains important issues for us. And there is no phasing out of research. On the contrary, much remains to be done, and the research agenda is long, and the need for international cooperation also remains. I'm therefore delighted that so many of you have responded to the call for the safeND Symposium, and I thank you very much for coming. I wish you an intense exchange and exciting discussions over the next few days, and I wish all of us a fruitful symposium with many new impulses, new collaborations, and project ideas. And to conclude, I would like to address the young scientists once again. Take this chance to participate in the discussions and, above all, use the opportunity to expand your network and develop professional prospects. I would be very delighted if you would remain part of our community and go on to help us to promote the safety of nuclear waste management. And now, I would like to hand over to Mr. Ahlswede. Thank you very much. Or I have to hand over to Christoph Hamann. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Stefan Tidow, for his opening speech, and thank you also very much for your support for being able to organize this big event, which is also for us a big deal. Yes, it is, indeed. Mr. Tidow has already, said who's going to be next. He's the head of our division for general research and international cooperation. Most of you have already met him, heard him, spoken to him 2 years ago for the premiere of safeND. He's called Jochen Ahlswede, and he will talk to us about research for resilience, safety, gaps, progress, and priorities. Why have we chosen this motto? What are our thoughts about it? What does it mean that we are all on a marathon when looking for safe repositories for nuclear waste? What does it mean when a pandemic affects us and makes our work and our experiences difficult? He will now outline all these aspects, and I'm happy to welcome him on stage. Thank you for your applause. Jochen. Hi.
Thank you very much. Mr. State Secretary, distinguished colleagues, allow me on behalf of the Federal Office for the Safety of Nuclear Waste Management to welcome you to the Interdisciplinary Research Symposium on the Safety of Nuclear Disposal Practices, safeND. BASE is hosting this scientific conference for the second time now, and I'm delighted about the great response. The symposium is a special place for scientific exchange for 3 reasons. First, at safeND, we are looking at the entire nuclear management chain rather than just individual steps. Our considerations begin with the decommissioning and dismantling, encompasses waste from nuclear activities such as uranium mining, and ends with the closure of the repository, as well as the necessary preservation of information thereafter, the long-term documentation. Second, we all know that nuclear waste management is not a purely technical task. We will therefore address issues from a range of different disciplines and adopt, where possible, interdisciplinary perspectives. For this reason, the social sciences and humanities play just as important a role at this conference as the natural sciences and the technical sciences. Third, we are focusing on questions on safety and fair and socially acceptable approaches to radioactive waste management. For us, as the science-based regulatory authority organizing this symposium, the decisive question is, what conditions must we create so that the legacies of nuclear power do not cause harm to people and the environment? So, where do we stand on nuclear waste management? 70 years after the first nuclear power plants went into operation, not a single country has a deep geological repository for high-level radioactive waste. Finland, we all know that, Finland is getting close, but Finnish waste accounts for just round about 0.5% of the world's inventory. So it's a very little amount where a solution is near. I dare say that if we were to look at the national archives of pretty much every country using nuclear power, we would find the following. Decades ago, in the early stages of civil nuclear programs, ambitious waste management programs and timelines were set. Yet, as time went on, the problems turned out to be more complex than expected. Priorities changed, and in the end, the timelines were delayed again and again. As a result, it must be acknowledged that on a global scale, we have not even remotely achieved the progress in nuclear waste management that had been intended when nuclear power was industrialized. The challenge posed by nuclear waste was underestimated in both technical and social terms. And the claim that it is only a political problem represents an under-complex narrative, to put it mildly. If we look at German history, for example, we can trace this development very precisely. Following the initial euphoria, key official documents show that the disposal issues were addressed very seriously from the early 1970s onwards. By no means was this question ignored. But where are we today, 50 years later? We are decades away from a final repository site, and currently we have to face the scenario that putting one into operation may take until the end of the century. The attitude adopted for discussing these facts is sometimes reminiscent of the psychological effect of the so-called shifting baselines. Perhaps you know this effect. Baselines are collectively shaped reference points we use to define what we assess as given or as normal, or what is no longer put into question. We know from socio-psychological environmental research that changes, or their significance, are no longer perceived if the frame of reference shifts gradually. To put it simply, at some point, one no longer perceives a situation, that a situation has slowly but fundamentally changed. This is especially true for changes that span generations. If you had told the leading decision makers and scientists in the 1960s that by 2023 we would have not managed to permanently dispose of a single spent fuel rod from civilian nuclear energy use, the reaction would probably have been bewilderment. Today, everyone seems to have gotten used to, perhaps even come to terms with the fact that in 2023, the operational disposal of high-level radioactive waste has not even begun anywhere in the world. Of course, this is not new for you as a scientific community or for us. What is thought-provoking, however, are the more recent developments that have massive impact in our society, and Mr. Tidow just mentioned a few of them. We face warlike conflicts affecting nuclear facilities. We witnessed a pandemic that had had an impact on the social and economic life down to the smallest everyday situations, and has at times even led to standstill. We face climate change, which is already having a negative global impact that will become even more pronounced in the future, also with regard to nuclear safety. These events raise two questions. First, we need to question our baselines. How much time do societies really have to solve the problem of radioactive waste according to the highest scientific standards? And secondly, we must decide how to design processes that will lead us to safe disposal in such a way that it can withstand unforeseen shocks. This second question inspired the decision to make resilience the focus of this year's safeND, following a suggestion from a project of the German Academy of Science and Engineering. The term resilience originates from developmental psychology and has seen a career in many fields of application in recent years. Applied to psychology, it refers to an individual's ability to cope with adverse life circumstances and remain healthy in the process. As a material science term, it describes the ability of a material to bend elastically under the influence of a certain amount of energy and thus to return to its original state. Ecologically speaking, it is the ability of an ecosystem to maintain its basic functionality in the face of disturbances. For example, in case of invasive species occur or of regional participation changes due to climate change. The term resilience is also increasingly used as a bridge concept in interdisciplinary fields of applications that deal with systems of any kind, such as security research for civil protection. When it comes to civil protection, resilience encompasses characteristics that contribute to preparedness as well as to the management of a crisis. It can be applied both to technical and social systems, which is why it is of interest, we think, for the topic of nuclear waste management. As regards the discussion in our subject area, I would like to propose the following definition of resilience based on Erik Holnagel, a Danish professor for psychology and specialist for resilience engineering. A system is resilient if it can adapt its operation before, during, and after events to changes, especially to unforeseen disturbances, thus maintaining its functionality under both expected and unexpected conditions. So, resilience is more than just robustness. Robustness describes the ability of a system to change as little as possible under disturbing influences, with the risk, of course, of collapse if the external influences become too great. To give an example, why it may have been a robust approach to pursue Gorleben-Site salt dome as central project in the nuclear waste management system in Germany for decades, it was certainly not resilient to do this. Applied to nuclear waste disposal safety, this concept leads to the following question. If we want to guarantee protection from nuclear waste for present and future generations, then how must we proceed to ensure the central safety functions are maintained over the entire nuclear management chain, even under adverse, unforeseen circumstances? This question can be discussed with regard to the disposal processes in national state system, for instance, with the following questions. How can the extension of interim storage be technically designed so that it is prepared for unpredictable external events in the future? What does resilience mean for the technical concept of final disposal? How can the safety functions of geological and geotechnical barriers in a repository be maintained even if unexpected events occur? This brings us, for example, to the issue of technical long-term safety and the limits of the features event processes methodology. Another question, should novel reactor types with completely different modes of operation be developed and commercialized somewhere else in the world? What would this mean for nuclear waste management? What new types of waste associated problems would this generate? On a social level, resilience is to be understood as an even more complex, multidimensional concept. What does resilience mean for the structure of institutional responsibility and organizational culture within these institutions? What requirements must be met for participation and communication processes to contribute to resilient safety? What does resilient communication mean, for example, between stakeholders, the scientific community, us, and the general public? And not to forget, how must legal norms, precautions, and objectives be designed to contribute to resilient safety and security? And the final question, which economic resources are needed to ensure the desired safety functions, and how long do they need to be available? So you see, resilience can be understood as an analytical category for the study of very different spatial and disciplinary scales, from the microstructure of a geotechnical barrier to institutional settings. The relationship between resilience and time is of particular importance here, because nuclear waste management involves particularly long periods of time. We all know that. Let me illustrate this using the example of the German site selection procedure for a final repository for high-level radioactive waste. The site selection process has been underway in Germany since 2017. The procedure was launched in the light of previous experience with failed repository projects in Germany. The procedure follows the principle of a science-based learning and participatory process that aims to find the site with the best possible safety in 3 possible host rocks. Along with the regulations on safety requirements, this process is probably one of the most elaborate and demanding of its kind worldwide. Many of its mechanisms, especially the participatory and learning elements, can be seen as an attempt to implement resilience into the nuclear waste management process. These features are currently being put to test after the project implementer submitted a timetable for the site selection procedure last year, which forecasts a site proposal to be made between 2046 and 2068. And according to our estimates, even these dates are not sure if they will be met when the process continues as it currently does. This situation preoccupies many of us, both colleagues in the responsible institutions and in the scientific community. Coming back to my initial point, if we are to expect crisis, external shocks, and resources uncertainties in the future, this means time is not only an analytical category, time itself is a safety factor in nuclear waste management, at least as long as the goal is a final repository. A resilient system does not maximize its safety functions simply by taking unlimited amounts of time for decision processes. The site selection process must now prove its resilience to this situation. Enforcing a once planned process, no matter what, would certainly not be resilient. A timeline that puts the realization of a repository far in the second half of the century or even beyond is not compatible with the idea of resilience in terms of nuclear waste management. I believe that these topics are worth exploring among the scientific community, although we all know that there are no easy answers to these big questions. Among other things, this year's safeND will provide a platform for these topics, discussing about resilience in different national systems. And I know that some of the contributions submitted will address these questions, and I'm very happy that we have these discussions also on this conference. Ladies and gentlemen, I invite you to keep in mind the question of resilience when you attend the individual sessions and take part in workshop discussions. How can we design nuclear waste management to maintain safety functions in the face of significant and unexpected disruptions? This year's program of safeND, it was just mentioned, is packed with 140 scientific contributions, 18 sessions, 13 workshops, 50 posters. So you will have the opportunity to engage with up to 300 participants from a total of 15 nations. In addition, we expect contributions from our keynote speakers, Allison MacFarlane, Nadezhda Gotcheva, and Martin Weiskopf, who will be addressing various aspects of the symposium's topic from their respective scientific and practical perspectives. I would like to thank them for their contributions and the productive discussions in preparing for the keynotes. I would like to thank also all members of the scientific committee for this conference, for their cooperation and for their assistance in the scientific quality assurance for this symposium. I would like to thank you, Mr. State Secretary, and of course the colleagues from the Ministry for the resources to organize this symposium. And last but not least, I would like to thank the organizational team at BASE, without whom this symposium could not have taken place. And especially Ms. Kaufold, Mr. Becker, and Mr. Dietl. Many more other members involved, but these three really made this conference work. So thank you very much, and I hope you will all enjoy 3 exciting days and engage interdisciplinary discussions. Thank you.
Oops, that was Jochen Ahlswede, our head of Research and International Affairs. Thank you very much for delivering this speech. And yes, time and safety are really interdependent. And when I take a look at the headlines of these days again, looking at the situation of, for example, in Zaporizhzhia, the nuclear power plant in Ukraine, I think it makes even, it does convince us that safety and time are very much interdependent and need solutions. Thank you very much for your speech once again. Now we come to our keynote, and Jochen Ahlswede has just named the one who's gonna give us the keynote. I had the pleasure of talking to her yesterday when we were rehearsing here. She's quite far away from us. Unfortunately, we would have really liked to have her here, but due to circumstances, we're still happy to have her keynote speech delivered from a distance as far as exactly 4,953 miles. She's based in Vancouver, British Columbia. She's professor and director of the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs. And I took a very close look at her CV. She holds a PhD from MIT in Boston. And she's the preeminent expert on nuclear waste management in North America. From 2021, she's been the first geologist to chair the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And her name is Allison MacFarlane. I hope we're going to see her now. We already do, sorry. I was having you in my back. Thank you for delivering the keynote speech this year. We see lots of books behind you, and now we're very much looking forward to your speech. And afterwards, we're also very happy to answer questions. Please be inspired already now. We'll have microphones here in this auditorium, and you'll have the opportunity to ask Allison MacFarlane about her keynote. Thank you very much. And now over, once again, almost 5,000 miles. What's the time in Vancouver?
It is 12:44 a.m.
Coffee time. I'll withdraw. Thank you.
Yeah, it's yesterday for you. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak. I am so sorry that I can't be there with you in person, but nonetheless, we can, through this the great technology of Zoom, have a chance to chat together about these issues, and they are very important issues. I completely agree. So I'm going to run through some slides and then save some time for some questions and discussion. Happy to have that time to talk with you. And so I'm going to give just an overview of what I think are some of the main challenges going forward with dealing with nuclear waste, both technical challenges and then societal challenges. As has been pointed out already, these both are interwoven issues when dealing with nuclear waste. It's truly an interdisciplinary field. All right, next slide. So let's just run through a little bit of background. Where are we in terms of nuclear waste status? We have been producing nuclear waste since we've been producing nuclear weapons, so since the 1940s. The latest data that I could find on global quantities of nuclear waste was 2016, which is incredibly long ago. But so that should tell you something there in and of itself, that nobody really tracks this as much as they track how many reactors exist and how much energy is produced by nuclear power. Nuclear waste often tends to be forgotten and neglected. And so there's a lot of spent fuel in both wet and dry storage around the world. And a third amount of that has been reprocessed, creating additional waste, which I'll talk about later. And of course, then there are large volumes of low and intermediate level waste that are significantly larger than those of high level waste. Next slide. So what are folks doing about this? Next slide. Okay. Sorry, go back one. Oh, yeah, perfect. So let's just briefly talk on low and intermediate level waste facilities. There are a number of countries that have these facilities already and have had them since the 1950s even. The United Kingdom, Spain, France, Japan. The US has 4 active low and intermediate level waste facilities. Sweden and Finland have deeper low and intermediate level waste facilities, but many countries do not, including Canada, where I am now. We do not have a low or intermediate level waste disposal facility. Next slide. But of course, we do have been talking about high level waste repositories, and nobody, as Jochen mentioned, nobody has any of these. One is under construction in Finland, as you know. A number of countries have selected sites for repositories: Sweden, France, Switzerland, Russia, potentially. A number of countries are seeking sites. Canada intends to select a site in 2024. Japan intends to select a site the following year. The Czech Republic, your own country, Germany, UK, Hungary, China, Slovakia are all seeking a site, and the US is who knows where. We'll talk about that a little later. All right, so that's sort of generally where we are. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to focus on the technical challenges. And next slide. And I'm going to start by talking about small and modular and advanced reactors. Jochen mentioned that in his remarks, and these potentially, if they come to pass, and that is a big if, will cause some perturbations in terms of dealing with nuclear waste. Next slide. So I was lucky enough to be part of a study that by the National Academy of Sciences in the US that looked at nuclear fuel cycles for advanced reactors. It just came out late last year. And we made a number of conclusions, which I want to share with you here, and then use some of that information and some of my own research to go a little more in depth on this topic. So basically, advanced reactors don't solve the problem of nuclear waste. They may exacerbate it. Most of the advanced reactors will generate types of waste for which there's little to no experience in managing this material. Large investments will be needed to make any of these reactors a reality. The once through fuel cycle is clearly the lowest cost, and it's the recommended fuel cycle by this committee. Most advanced reactors plan to use high assay, low enriched uranium fuel, and that has its own implications, which I'll talk about later. Any reprocessing or recycling of spent fuel will introduce safety and environmental considerations. And of course, the costs of these fuel cycles will be very high, ranging from several billion US dollars for prototypes to hundreds of billions of US dollars for full deployment. Next slide. So the reactor types that I'm going to talk about, small modular reactors themselves tend to be less than 300 megawatts. Not all of these are going to be less than 300 megawatts, but in any case, there are light water reactors, otherwise known as, the small ones are integral light water reactors. Sodium-cooled fast reactors, there are some lead-cooled designs out there as well. High temperature gas reactors, molten salt reactors, and heat pipes. There are many, many different reactor designers out there, many based in the US. Next slide. And I'll talk about some of the waste implications from them. The waste implications from small modular reactors derive directly from physics. It's the problem of neutron leakage, okay? So the probability of neutron leakage from any reactor is a function of reactor dimensions and neutron diffusion length. So generally, the smaller the reactor, the more leakage you'll have for any given reactor type. Okay, and you can try to manage the neutron leakage by using reflectors within the core of the reactor and redirecting the neutrons back into the core by increasing the enrichment of the fuel, thus the need for high assay, low enriched uranium fuel in all but the light water reactors. Changing the moderator, playing with the batch loading and the burn up. Okay, but the bottom line is that due to neutron leakage, small modular reactors can end up with more spent fuel and more low and intermediate level waste than large energy equivalent pressurized water reactors. That's the bottom line there. Next slide. So let me talk a little bit more about some of the waste implications from these different reactor types. So for the pressurized water reactors, the light water reactors, if they are small modular reactors, you will see a potentially increased mass of spent fuel and certainly increased low and intermediate level waste from activation of near core components, the reflectors and that kind of material. For sodium cooled fast reactors, the sodium bonded uranium metal fuel is going to have to be processed prior to disposal in a repository. It's not stable and capable of being disposed of in a repository. Neutron reflectors and shielding will increase the low and intermediate level waste, and the salt coolant in a sodium cooled fast reactor will be contaminated by sodium-22 activation products and cesium isotopes from any potentially ruptured elements, and that will also have to be managed as probably low-level waste. For high-temperature gas reactors, they will most likely use what's called TRISO fuel. TRISO fuel is a uranium grain that's surrounded by carbide, graphite essentially, and many layers of graphite. And so you have these little grains that you put together in some kind of larger graphite matrix, either a prism or a large pebble. And so that may actually be quite robust in a repository, depending on the geologic environment in the given repository. And so we need to do more research there, but it may be a robust waste form. But there's going to be a lot of graphite. And unless you extract the uranium fuel from the spent fuel from the graphite matrix, you're going to have significantly more volume of waste to manage. You'll have significantly more volume of either high-level waste, or if you extract the uranium, then low-level or intermediate-level waste that you're going to have to manage somehow. And then finally, molten salt reactors. These are the least mature of these reactor technologies. And there are going to be many novel waste streams associated with molten salt reactors. Of course, there will be graphite moderators and reflectors from the dealing with the neutron leakage. And these will have to be replaced regularly, as well as the reactor vessel will probably have to be replaced regularly, because it will be corroded by the salt itself. And so that will be a whole waste stream. There are off-gas fission products produced by molten salt reactors. You will need to develop waste forms for these fission products first. The fuel salt itself will need its own waste form. And if the fuel salt is fluoride, tend to produce hydrofluoric acid. Next slide. Where we talk, yeah, okay, and you can click through a bit. One more, that's it, good. So in terms of spent fuels, molten salt reactor fuel will definitely need to be processed, especially if it is a fluoride salt, because it tends to produce hydrofluoric acid, and it's not suitable either for disposal or potentially storage. And so you'll need to use some kind of processing technique and then conditioning into some kind of stable waste form. Sodium fast reactors will also need processing to manage the sodium bonded fuel. What are the processing implications? Of course, you're going to have additional waste streams. Any kind of processing will create large volumes of low-level waste that will require disposal. Of course, you need to build facilities and establish supply chains, etc. Next slide. Other wastes produced by processing. If you are processing, of course, light water reactor fuel to extract plutonium, to create mixed oxide or MOX fuel, for instance, we know that the Purex process vastly increases the low and intermediate level waste volumes by up to 7 times, although it does reduce the high level waste volume, but the waste volumes, the high level waste volume in particular, is not an appropriate unit of measure for determining repository capacity. For high level waste, what's important is heat production and the concentration of low solubility species in the waste itself. That's what's relevant to determining repository capacity. And just as an example, if you end up disposing of spent MOX fuel directly because you decide that you can't process it again or it's not worthwhile, spent MOX fuel gives out 3 times the amount of heat as spent LEU, low enriched uranium fuel. It also has 25% more iodine-129 and 2 times the minor actinides than a regular spent LEU fuel. And of course, this will directly impact repository capacity. Next slide. So there are as well security and safeguards issues associated with advanced reactors. On the front end, in terms of the high assay low enriched uranium, these materials may require special packaging for storage and transport and disposal to deal with not only the processing, etc., but also to deal with criticality issues. And because HALEU presents more of a security risk than light water, like low enriched uranium fuel, there may be security and safeguards issues there. And any processing or reprocessing that separates any actinides is going to require additional security and safeguards measures. So something to keep in mind. Next slide. So the implications of advanced reactors for waste, they have each type of different reactor will have different challenges associated with it. Most likely, small modular reactors are going to increase relatively waste volumes that need to be managed. And bottom line is that advanced reactors do not reduce the waste problem and may make it more complex and certainly more costly to manage. All right. Next technical issue that I want to tackle are there any game changers? And yeah, thanks. On to the next slide. And in particular, I want to talk briefly about deep boreholes. In general, most countries are looking at a mined geologic repository, but there has been a fair amount of discussion of deep boreholes for managing wastes. Deep Isolation and Nuclear Safe are 2 companies that have gotten a fair bit of press over the past few years. The idea would be to emplace wastes to depths of 600 meters to 5 kilometers. And the idea is to take advantage of properties of the deep geosphere, like high salinity of groundwater and low permeability, low groundwater flow, and reducing geochemistry. But, and there's a big but associated with this. So next slide. The concepts there are 2 sort of general concepts. One, which is the the long, deep, straight, vertical 5-kilometer borehole, or a borehole that goes vertical for some distance. Maybe it's 600 meters, maybe it's 1,000 meters, and then goes horizontal. And so you emplace the material horizontally. Both of these have real challenges. One initial challenge is that the diameter of the borehole cannot really exceed 45 centimeters because of limitations from drilling. Next slide. But also, it turns out that the geosphere is quite complicated. Salinity can really vary at different depths, depending on the particular geologic conditions. The redox conditions are locally dependent, and the pH can affect the performance of the canister or the plug of the borehole or the waste form itself. And water flow will be important. There are real issues about plugging boreholes. If you put cement in them, the cement does shrink, and it will create gaps that will allow water flow. There may be fractures that form in the plug. And if you start trying to emplace the waste horizontally, you will encounter geology that you don't really understand necessarily, and it's not predictable. Next slide. So there are many unanswered questions associated with boreholes. You know, what are the best plug materials? Because the diameter is limited, the canister that you're going to have to use will, by definition, have a thin wall. And what would be the mechanical behavior of this thin-walled canister? What will you do if the canister gets stuck 1 kilometer down? Do you abandon the borehole? What are the impacts for health and safety? And so I think there are many unanswered questions. There are many difficult regulatory questions around boreholes. And I don't think that they are going to be a game changer in terms of managing high-level waste. All right, on to the next section. So let's talk a little bit about societal challenges moving forward. And in particular, let's focus on a few failures. And the US is going to be front and center in the failure category right now. Many countries, I should say, have failed, and they've tried again, and then some have succeeded. Some countries have failed, tried again, failed, tried again, and then succeeded. That would be something like Sweden. But Sweden, France, Canada, Switzerland, they've all tried, failed, and we'll see how far they get. In the US, you know, the US was initially the leader in terms of nuclear waste disposal. In 1982, they passed the Nuclear Waste Policy Act. Then things started to go awry in 1987 when they amended the Policy Act and only examined one site, Yucca Mountain. Prior to that, they were going to be looking at 3 sites in detail and then choosing the best of the 3. But Congress decided to only consider one site. That site was finally approved by the president in 2002. It was vetoed by the state of Nevada. Nevada has always, since 1987, opposed a repository in their state, but Congress overrode that veto. There was a license application submitted by the Department of Energy to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in 2008. President Obama was elected, and in 2010, the Department of Energy withdrew the license application. No congressional funding has been appropriated for Yucca Mountain since 2010, and right now there really aren't any good prospects for moving forward. There aren't any champions to move this forward. The industry apparently can build nuclear power plants without solving this problem. The Department of Energy is hamstrung by the law and by the lack of funds. Public interest groups don't seem to want to do anything, so nothing is really moving forward. Next slide. So let's talk about another failure, Australia. Some of you may have heard about the recent Australia failure. Now, this has to do with a low-level waste site. Australia has tried multiple times over multiple decades to find a low-level waste site. In Woomera in South Australia and Muckety Station in the Northern Territories, and then now most recently in a town near Kimba in South Australia again. All of these siting efforts failed due to lawsuits from either the affected state or an Indigenous group. South Australia, and the most recent effort, South Australia became the focus in 2017. 2 sites were investigated, both on privately owned land. There was no formal implementing agency. It was just part of the government that was managing this. But the government kept changing the goalposts. So one of the government ministers initially said that they really wanted broad community support, and that would be at least 65% of the vote. Well, when the community voted and only 57% approved the site, the same minister said, oh, well, that's fine. That demonstrates broad community support. Who could vote was also contentious. In the Hawker community, the local Indigenous community, the Aboriginal community, was allowed to be part of the vote. But in the Kimba community, the Barngala people, the traditional owners of land near Kimba, were not allowed to vote. Eventually, the Barngala people sued, and last month or 2 months ago, they won their lawsuit. And now the government has abandoned the site near Kimba. Of course, a number of other goalposts kept changing as well. Bottom line, the communities were really torn apart by this. And I've been able to go and do some research there and talk to folks there and learn firsthand about the situation. Next slide, please. So some lessons on what works and what doesn't work. So what doesn't work, clearly, a decide, announce, defend approach like the US did. The government's going to pick a site, we're going to and try to defend it. That is not working. Any kind of clear political or industry influence, and I would argue that in the US, there's certainly been a fair amount of political influence in the process. No champions. You need somebody to carry the flag for this. If a community is not allowed a veto, a proper veto, that is a problem. If you change the rules of engagement constantly, that will be a problem. And all of this contributes to a lack of trust, which is a problem. If there are questionable technical analyses, there's a lot of controversy over technical analysis. There is no understandable and acceptable safety case made. That's also potentially a problem. If there isn't an implementer and if there aren't sufficient funds, that's a problem as well. Okay, so what do we need to make this work? Next slide. Okay, so what does work? And this list in part is drawn from another study from the US National Academies that I was involved in about advanced reactors. This study had a chapter looking at public acceptance and societal issues. And frankly, I drew a lot of my knowledge of what might be important for siting nuclear reactors from my experience of dealing with siting nuclear waste repositories. And so what's important for nuclear waste repository siting? Well, certainly a participatory process of site selection, whether you want to call it consent-based or whatever, you need some kind of participatory process, not decide, announce, defend. A right to veto or opt out. And that's important. And it's important to think carefully about who you are including in the boundaries of decision making. And in a number of countries, including Indigenous groups, is very important. And that's certainly applies to Australia and Canada, and happy to talk about that more in the Q&A, and the US, but other countries as well. Some form of compensation is important. It doesn't have to be monetary. It can be in other forms, but at the same time, recall that communities can't really be bought off. So certainly people need compensation, but you shouldn't think of this as a bribe. It's important for the affected community to be able to conduct their own independent analyses, technical and social, and have funding to do so. I would argue that Sweden's model of providing funds for public interest groups is important. It's important because it's important to have somebody in US government terms, red team you, sort of be your antagonist, find the holes in what you're trying to put forward. It's important to be consistent and don't change the goalposts in what you plan. Legal partnerships between the implementer, sorry, that there's a typo there, and the community are important. It can be important for the community to retain some kind of control over the facility in some way. And of course, trust of the implementer and the regulator is really important. If the implementer and regulator aren't trusted to begin with, it's going to be a heavy lift to get this going. Openness and transparency of both the implementer and regulator are also important. And let me explain briefly what I mean by openness and transparency. Openness is being open to hearing and different points of view and adjusting what you're doing based on the needs of others. Transparency is making available all the documentation and the decision-making processes. And then finally, if things really aren't working, you have to be prepared to walk away. Okay, next slide. So just some final thoughts and some questions. So we already, many countries already have a large nuclear waste problem that requires a solution. I would argue sooner rather than later, because I don't trust that institutions, government institutions, are going to be around for a long time to protect us. So right now we have functioning democracies. We'll see how long that lasts in the US. That work and that we can trust to try to keep the public safe. But we don't know 50, 100 years from now what will change. So I would say that's an argument for moving sooner rather than later. Solving the nuclear waste problem is clearly both a technical and societal issue. Okay, both must receive equal weight and adequate funding. Trust is essential in a democracy, as I've said already. And repository setting is an iterative process. You try and try again. That's certainly been the case with most countries that have attempted this. But at the same time, we need to be mindful of the costs, the economic implications, the proliferation impacts, the safety, the security associated with this. So just a few questions to consider going forward. Do we need to solve the nuclear waste problem before we build new nuclear power plants? And is it the responsibility of the generation that created the waste to dispose of the waste? And should this responsibility be fixed in regulation? And then who's going to manage and pay for these wastes in the future? If we don't manage them now and we don't have adequate funds to do so now, who's going to do it in the future? Especially if processing is required for novel wastes, for instance, or new technologies needed to manage these wastes. So I'll leave that there, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Allison MacFarlane, thank you very much for your keynote. That was an impressive, broad range, of very huge perspective on this topic. Once again, thank you very much, and I'm happy to accept your questions now. As promised, there's the first one, and I'd like to make it a little easier for you as well, Allison MacFarlane, to combine two questions. This will be the first. Another question, please, on this side maybe, from you. Perfect. We'll start with the gentleman over here, and maybe you can let us know who you are, where you're working, and then address your question. Please.
Thank you. My name is Jean Croiset. I'm working in Switzerland, company Intera, and working in the nuclear waste disposal business since 30 years. And with just a comment about failed tries, which I don't understand that you list France in that list, because to my knowledge, there is no failed try in France. All the process of waste disposal is currently ongoing. We are the license application stage for the deep geological repository. We have a lot of low-level and disposal sites. So I don't understand why you put France in the list.
Thank you for your question. That's about France, a country that relies heavily on nuclear power and is also busy finding a repository place. And the second question, I would like to collect these two. Please introduce yourself, if possible, and then follow with your question.
Well, thank you. My name is David Brazier. I work in the UK or England Environment Agency, one of the regulators. So thank you, Allison, for a lucid presentation of the facts. And I know you get a hard time in the US, particularly your last article, Institute of Art and Ideas, I think, where you characterize the billionaire backers of the advanced reactors as part of this tech bro libertarian culture. And you've had some backlash, I see, from Ted Norhaus, the Breakthrough Institute, and it's really like an ad hominem attack about your background. And so how do you deal with all that, or do you just let it flow by?
Thank you very much for your question as well. Now we have two questions. Allison MacFarlane, please, your answers. France, UK, we have all the world here in Café Moscow.
Wonderful. Okay, so France, it's a great question. France is doing a great job now, but it did try in the early 1990s to find a different site, or even before the 1990s, to find some waste sites. They were particularly interested in granite, in crystalline rock, and so they attempted to move forward, and the community was not very happy with it, and that led to rethinking and some new legislation that allowed them to move forward with the current plan. So they did try, and they failed, and they went back and did some more legislative work, and there you go. Now they're moving forward. So I think they do qualify. In terms of the attacks, yeah, most of them seem to come from Ted Norhaus. And fortunately, I don't read a lot of Twitter, so I don't even notice them.
Thank you.
But I have gotten a fair amount of praise for that article, so I just focus on that.
Your questions, your opportunity. Please. There's one. As far as I can see, it's Herr Pistner. Okay, second question on this side, please. You'll be next. Please, over to you.
Yeah, hello, Allison. Great to see you, and I'm very sorry that you couldn't come over here. I would have pleased to meet you again in person. I have just two short questions on
This is
your great
Christoph
talk.
Pissner.
Yeah, Christoph Pissner
Please.
from the Öko-Institut in Darmstadt, exactly. First, you made a short remark about the US operators and their obligation to deal with high-level waste. Could you a little bit more elaborate on this? Do they have an obligation to look for a final repository? How are they involved in this? And my second question would be, you cited the National Academy studies, which is rather critical on reprocessing. Nevertheless, as far as I see, US NRC is moving towards that direction, thinking about changing the US policy on this. Could you say a little bit more? Is there movement in the US on rethinking their position on reprocessing, or don't you see any movement in that direction?
Thank you. Two questions in a package. And your question, please, and let us know who you are.
Yes, my name is Stefan. I'm working at BASE in the research department. Thank you very much for this exciting presentation. I've got a question to your points of what doesn't work. That's where you started with, and then what does work. You had two lists of bullet points. Well, my main question is, well, do they all have to be fulfilled or just one? So that's because, of course, for the German process, that's quite disturbing to see some points under the what does work list that we don't have. So if they all needs to be fulfilled, then it's not a good situation for us. I guess it's somewhat in the middle, you know, it's better more fulfilled than not so much. But maybe related to this is a question that you said that among what does not work is the decide, announce, defend approach. And I think that refers to deciding for the site, you know, decide, announce, defend about the site, so that does not work. But what about taking it to a meta level? So decide, announce, defend about the process of finding a site. Because at least that's an advantage of the German process, that they had a committee before the process which did discuss it. So it was not a decide, defend, announce, defend process decision, but it was a kind of discussed process decision. So how would you value this point?
Thank you very much for your question as well. Over to you,
Okay,
Allison
great.
MacFarlane.
Thanks, Christoph, and sorry I'm not there to have a beer with you. Next time. All right, so your questions. The US operators actually don't have any obligation to do anything. They are obligated to manage the waste safely on site, and they are obligated, or they were obligated, to collect money for the nuclear waste fund, and that was a tenth of a cent per kilowatt hour. But that was knocked down by a court a number of years ago now, so nobody's collecting that at the moment. But it is the government's obligation to manage and dispose of spent fuel. That's what's in the law, unfortunately. So that's what we're stuck with. And so there's no need for the reactor operators to push for a solution. Especially if they're thinking of their bottom line, or they're, making money just for the next few years. They don't really care about a long-term solution. In terms of rethinking reprocessing, reprocessing is a zombie that won't die in the US. It always seems to struggle along, getting a little bit of funding. The Biden administration is still providing a little funding for this. Do I think that this will actually become a reality? No, because it's going to be too expensive. That's why actually the US started to back up of processing in the 1970s, besides the fact that then President Ford and then President Carter indefinitely deferred reprocessing because of proliferation concerns. But before that happened, actually, it was becoming quite clear that it was really expensive to reprocess. And so the reprocessing facility at Barnwell in South Carolina never really went anywhere because it was too expensive. And the West Valley plant in New York shut down. It was also too expensive. So uranium is plentiful and cheap and will be for the foreseeable future. In terms of Stefan's questions, does the entire list of what works have to be fulfilled? No. These are best practices that I've observed in different countries. And of course, different countries and different cultures, different things will work, right? But it's good to have a lot of the list ticked off. I'd say a majority of the list ticked off instead of, only 50%, for instance. And then in terms of the decide, announce, defend approach, that what I meant by decide, announce, defend has to do with the government itself just picking a site, saying, oh, we're going to put it there. We're not going to ask the affected community whether they are in, whether they want this or not, and we're just going to try to push it forward, which has been the approach with Yucca Mountain.
Thank you so far. One of my goals or aims today is to have an eye on our quite tight schedule this morning. But since we're already in such a very nice flow, please let us go for 2 more questions. Maybe short questions and Allison MacFarlane, maybe not too long answers. Would that be a compromise? Thank you. Relieved. Starting with the left side, coming over to the right side, maybe. Up to you. Maybe the lady in pink, if I may say so. You're going for the first question? Yes? Is that a yes? Perfect. And number 2 will be here in front. You'll be next after you.
Thank you for an interesting presentation. My name is Václava Havlova. I'm from International Atomic Energy Agency, Vienna. And I have a more comment concerning borehole disposal. Borehole disposal is definitely an optimistic solution for small inventory countries, which usually consider disused sealed radioactive sources. There are several active attempts. The other waste to be disposed in a deep borehole, this question is still open. However, I would like to announce that Atomic Agency just opened the new CRP, Coordinated Research Project, enhancing global knowledge on deep borehole disposal for nuclear waste, which answers the questions of countries like Croatia, Austria, Norway, to find solution for other wastes. But as I mentioned, this question is still open. And this CRP should also target until some trial, the real trial in the field. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this comment.
Just for you to know.
Yeah, thank you. And maybe the gentleman over here, close to me.
Yeah, I'm Liang Gazheng from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, US DOE National Lab. Unfortunately, this country has been mentioned here as the frontier of failure. Now, while I'm listening to your presentation, I kept thinking, as someone who works on the technology side, what are the biggest elephant in terms of technology problem that prevent public from accepting a nuclear waste repository? Because it seems that the public acceptance or political reason is the reason that we delayed the building a nuclear repository.
Thank you very much. One statement, one question. Over to you, Allison MacFarlane.
In terms of the boreholes of disposal for sealed sources, I think boreholes may be appropriate for smaller packages, but spent fuel is long and enormous and maybe difficult to manage. So I'll watch the IAEA program carefully. I'm sorry, but I couldn't hear the question. The microphone was sort of cutting out, so maybe you could repeat it, Christian?
Could you do this again? Can we pass over the microphone once more, please? We'll have it sorted. Thank you. Once again.
So the question is about, what do you see is the biggest technology issue that prevent public from accepting a repository?
I don't think it's a technical issue per se, okay? I think it's an issue of trust. It's an issue of, largely it's an issue of trust. So I don't think there's a big technical issue per se. I mean, I think it's pretty clear to folks that Yucca Mountain is located in a seismically active area. And the US is the only country in the world that I know of that's looking at a repository in an oxidizing environment. I mean, there's some real outliers around the technical side of things. Nonetheless, it could probably work okay for some thousands of years, 10,000 of years or something like that. Who knows? If society decides that 10,000 years is reasonable, great. So anyway, but I don't think it's a technical issue. That's the thing here. I don't think that's what's blocking things.
Thank you very much, Allison MacFarlane. We'd like to give you another very big applause considering the time, your time.
Thank you.
Please,
I wish you a really good conference.
And we do wish you some more hours of a very sound sleep. You have well deserved it. Thank you very much. Hope to see you again.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Yes, take care.
Thank you for your questions as well. And now we'd like to come to the next point in our today's schedule. It will be the last before a well-deserved coffee break. It will be a panel discussion. And for this panel discussion, of course, the panel discussion will once again deal with our motto this year, the resilience, safety. And I have 4 guests, and I would like to ask them to come on stage and take a seat. This first is Sophie Kuppler. She's from the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology. Thank you for coming. Next one will be Jan-Henrik Meyer. He's from the Max Planck Institute for Legal History and Theory. Next distinguished guest is Claudio Pescatore or Pescatore? Pescatore, now I know Italian as well. He formerly worked, among other well-known institutions, for the OECD. And a guest you already do know, that is Jochen Ahlswede from BASE. So, once again, dim a bit, the lights. The lights are very strong. Could we put the volume a bit down, maybe? Otherwise, we don't have enough sunglasses available at the moment. Better? Sunglasses. Okay. So, once again, thank you very much for coming and being here for this conference. And I would like to start asking ladies first. Frau Kuppler, that is, what is your stance towards resilience? What does it mean to you when it comes to nuclear waste management? What is your perspective on it?
It's working? Yes, wonderful. Well, good morning also from my side. First, maybe to my background, I'm a researcher at the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology, Institute for Technology Assessment and Systems Analysis. So my background is in technology assessment, and that's also the stance from which or the way in which I'm looking at this term of resilience. And Jochen Ahlswede, you already mentioned many approaches that are mentioned in literature and what resilience can mean. And I'd like to add a bit on that, take a look in literature that is close to technology assessment and try a definition of what it could mean from my perspective for nuclear waste. And well, this very basic definition we all know, it's the ability to deal with external shocks or shocks per se. And from there it diverges in literature, and there's this technical resilience, there's individual resilience, there's ecological resilience, social resilience, and probably also need something like socio-technical resilience. And one way to try to sort all those strands and maybe get an idea of what it could mean is kind of characteristics that my colleagues Jürgen Kopfmüller and Paulina Dobroc suggested. It's that there's this understanding of resilience that means bouncing back, so going back to a state that was there before. And the second is more this, what also Cornelius Holthoff said, bouncing forward. So creating something new that is better adapted at dealing with the new characteristics that are there after the shock. And I think the second one is one that we really need to think about and talk about with regard to nuclear waste governance, even though we also need maybe parts of the first one, this bouncing back when it comes to certain safety aspects. So resilience to me is about maintaining the fundamental properties of a system through a certain openness towards the future. And the qualities that we need for this, there's also some suggestions for this in literature. For example, Briggs et al., they suggest that it is very important to encourage learning, to broaden participation, and to also promote polycentric governance. And my colleague Ulrich Smeddings, he mentioned transparency, legitimation, and deliberation. And I think many of the aspects that were just now mentioned by Allison and MacFarlane, they also fall into this category of qualities and characteristics that we need to be able to bounce forward. So one difficulty that I find comes with this resilience term is that it doesn't tell us where to bounce to. So there's no ethical aspects in the definition per se of where to go. So what we need is what Schneider and Vogt call responsible resilience. This means we need to talk about what actually are those characteristics that we want to preserve, what are the system traits that are really important and that we need to preserve. And to me, this is not only safety, but it would also be democratic decision-making. It would mean things like civil conflict resolution and also functioning checks and balances in the democratic system. So even though resilience to me is not really a state, it's not something that we reach and can say, okay, now we have a resilient system, but it's a process. It's an invitation to debate, an invitation to reflect and to learn in a system and work towards preserving those functions that we together need to identify.
Thank you for this definition. Jan-Henrik Meyer, would you please continue? What is your definition?
Thank you very much. Yeah, my definition is rather similar actually to what Sophie has already said. I'm a historian with a strong background in social sciences. I've been part of a large research project on the history of nuclear energy in society, HONEST, that has compared across Europe the experience of nuclear energy and society in a historical perspective, and we've just completed another project on the information and communication campaign in the 1970s and 80s in West Germany, and it's against that backdrop that I try to define resilience. And I think resilience is a long-term, sufficiently rational, and foolproof and publicly acceptable solution to a problem, a solution that will not easily be toppled by events and changes. This is really the historian's perspective in this. This means establishing institutions, as has been tried in Germany, as has been tried elsewhere, that are long-term, but we can never be sure, as Allison MacFarlane said. And in this sense, these institutions have to continuously rebuild legitimacy and credibility. So it's a process, as has been said earlier too. And this is, my idea is really based on the background of the experience in the past, you said 70 years, maybe 50 years. Also, in many countries, nuclear energy has been developed with very little concern for the long-term consequences, with resilience has not really been the foremost concern. There's like what Allison MacFarlane said about the people who are developing small medium reactors now. The interest was short term. It was sort of how can we get the next reactor online? How can we get a bottom line? So economically and politically, how can we ensure energy security, a concern that we have now that we also had in the 70s? And so it was only done what was absolutely necessary, and the concern for the future was there maybe on a technical level, but not at a political level. And this had implications for what I want to call democratic resilience. And that's very similar to what Sophie has also said. It's really caring to ensure and to realize the promises of information, participation, and in the end, gain trust. Thank you.
Gain trust, yeah. Good keyword. Thank you, Jan-Henrik Meyer. And just looking over to you, Claudio Pescatore. Yeah. What is your definition? Then we already heard Jochen Ahlswede's definition in his speech. Now we'll come to you.
I was impressed by all the definitions that there are about resiliency. So I look at the safety of nuclear disposal practices. So it's about resilient safety, and it talks about disposal. So perhaps one of the questions I will ask later, Jochen, is disposal, geological disposal, a resilient technology? But also, I would like to insist that the safety is a societal construct. It's not something which is absolute. What was considered safety in the 50s is not what is considered safety today. And Allison said, well, if people are fine with this repository being performing like this for 10,000 years, like other countries have 1 million years, you see, then it's fine. So you can see that they look at the definition of safety as something different from different countries. You have a 1 million year criteria, and some have no long-term criteria. So safety is a contemporaneous concept, and resilient wanted to be forever. Resilient has no contemporaneity to it. So to some extent, the two terms are really conflicting. So you have to make something which is safe over time, and it has to meet the needs of today's and also, to some extent, the needs of the future. So you have to construct a process, which is to get something which is a process which is resilient, not only for now, but also for the future. And this must be a participatory process by which you define the technical safety, and it will be resilient because it will go through various phases, and eventually we'll get there because we'll get there together as a societal aspect. And then for later on, because of course the resilience is what you can do varies with time. Time is an important concern. Then you have to create mechanisms that when the repository is closed, for instance, people still have the right to keep an eye on this. Resiliency then will require that BASE, the regulator and the society, says we do not want to forget this, and we will build mechanisms that future generation will have some right to keep an eye on this. Thank you.
Thank you for all your definitions. Thank you. I've got my headset here. I'm remembering the keynote of Allison MacFarlane, and she said right at the beginning, nuclear waste tends to be neglected or even forgotten. Very pessimistic, but probably realistic statement. And the question that comes to my mind, that after 7 decades of nuclear energy use, the disposal mainly of high-level radioactive waste remains relatively unsuccessful, and there's not a clear solution for that. as we have in Germany the saying that the plane has started but there's no space for a landing ground. Why is that after so many decades and after such a very long time? Almost any other problem should have been easily solved in such a long time. Jochen Ahlswede, professionally dealing with this question as well. Do you have an explanation why it takes so long?
Oh, I'm more interested in the answer of a historian, I think. But perhaps to comment on this first round, I think it's for us now. We have learned for a few decades about failures. Allison MacFarlane told us about that, and we all know that. I think you can't discuss about this resilience independent from the national and cultural context. So it's a question which we cannot solve globally with this one solution, and then we have the solution for all. I think this is also clear that there are different solutions, different answers perhaps for resilient safety in nuclear waste management for different cultures and different national contexts. I think one important point, and I think that, to answer your question, has not happened in the past enough, is to think in internet scenarios and to think in alternatives. What could happen? What are the extremes and unthinkable events that perhaps could happen? And that you don't have these mechanisms Claudio just talked about. You don't have these mechanisms to react on these unexpected events. And I think this is, for me, it's one important thing that we have such conferences like this to discuss also these mechanisms which can answer to this unexpected events and to think about how to implement perhaps them into a national waste management systems. Of course, learning processes, participatory processes are important, but also important is the ability to make decisions in this process. So this is because there's no so simple solution for this conflicting targets. But I think this is as important to have a system which can make good and trustful decisions, as well as take your time to learn and to make participatory processes. You have to have a system which can, at some point, make decisions, because otherwise you can learn, but you will never solve the problem, and then there will be no long-term safety.
So as I understand, for this rather general question, why is there not more progress? Why there's such a delay? It needs individual answers, considering each and every country, for example, and its special circumstances around it. Sophie Kuppler, is that my right definition?
Well, I think there are many answers, and I would definitely agree that what is a resilient safety depends on the country and on the also democratic system that is there, and all the decision-making systems that are there. And for me, one of the main reasons, we haven't really succeeded in building a repository, but when we look at what kind of industry this is, we really have succeeded in turning a historically very secretive industry with multiple geotechnical entanglements or geopolitical entanglements into a matter of relatively open public debate. And this learning process was and is sometimes really painstakingly slow. And I think in some ways this really we can't change that in some aspects, because there's so many actors involved with many interests, with many values at stake, with many political interests at stake, and also with a very complex topic that we have to take the decisions on. And on the other hand, it could be accelerated by if we really go for learning processes to be at the center of decision making, and if we really facilitate, and if the leading authorities really facilitate and allow for learning processes to take place, and then of course also have a feeling for when there's the right point to close a debate and to take a decision.
Jan-Henrik, Meyer, maybe you can continue, please.
I agree, and with your very specific answer, I want to go back and raise really a more general point. What I think is an important driving factor for the inability to solve this problem is really that logic of externalization, of sort of postponing things to others, into the future, postponing things into, or externalizing it to others, to the people in Yucca Mountain, to those Aborigines in Australia. And it's that same logic that we also apply or have been applying to climate change. It's a general characteristic of our industrial societies that we tend to, also out of a situation where companies are in competition, where politics is a process of competition, where you put these bads aside and try to concentrate on the goods. And I think that has been an important driver. And in this, and they are actually, it comes with costs to decide, and to decide to internalize these costs. And this, I think, these political costs are very high, and this is why it's inconvenient to take these decisions, and this is why, from the perspective of a policymaker, it's actually very nice that this will be postponed into the... I'm being slightly ironic, but it's sort of this logic might be in place, and I totally agree with you that we will also forget if we continue to try learning. There will be also a loss of information over time, and it's actually dangerous to postpone for too long. And I've another little point on your scenarios. I think scenarios are the only way to address these problems of resilience, but scenarios are always quite necessarily based on assumptions. It's important to be aware of these. And there's wonderful histories on the history of scenarios. I can recommend that to you as nice reading.
As we've heard before from Allison MacFarlane, there's never been any kind of dealing with future generations about costs, about safety issues, about all that. It's always been something that the present generation somehow sorted out and decided, building a power plant, but no answers looking for the future.
Okay, first I would like to be a little more positive than you guys are, because...
Welcome.
Because you see, you have Entsorgung, you have final disposal, and that has been chosen as a solution. So you have a solution. So the issue is implementing the solution. And over 70 years, people have stuck to this choice, and there have been enormous amount of studies, Academy of Sciences in Sweden, I'm certain here in Germany through the AKN certainly, and this is stable. We know we have a solution, and apparently it's also a pretty resilient solution. I mean, it's been chosen so that surface effects, people whims, climate change, things that have little or no effects. And in some situations, like here in Germany, the salt domes have been stable with all glaciation for like 250 million years. So we have a solution. So we should not be, and we should remember this. And this has been defended, studied, and people have constantly come back to that solution. And by the way, I also liked very much the idea, the fact that Germany will go for a deep solution for all kinds of waste, whereas other countries have other more close to the surface solution, which is, in my opinion, is not resilient, because in these other types of waste, there is also not only radioactive materials, but there's also toxic material that one day will become available for. So we have this. I insist that we have to have. Now, it is true that in terms of long-term responsibilities, we need to do more. People have said, in Sweden, for instance, well, we can make this decision later on. I mean, it takes 8 years to to build these repositories. Perhaps we can take this decision later on, and these decisions are now being taken. But in some countries, this decision is taken already, like in the US. Well, it is the government. And so the government bears all the costs. And perhaps here in Germany as well, now that you have decided to phase out nuclear, it's all the waste is just a government problem. So we know what it is. So to some extent, there are some ideas. But it seems to me that we have to think which are the mechanisms which we put in place, not only to get to the decision and to closure. And the decision to closure, it must be a stepwise decision. It cannot be, we close. So there will be provisions to retrievability of the waste. There's provisions for reversibility of decisions. So in my opinion, what comes later is more important, because we don't think as a species of the future. People, architects, they talk about 50 years. They have like 50 years in mind.
It's too far away. It's too far away.
Yeah, it's too far away. So a few hundred years is already far away. Only archives tend to think in a few hundred years. And archives, we know they can disappear. I think it was in Cologne, somewhere in Germany, 1.1 big archives fell out. They can be inundated. I mean, there are all sorts of things. So we must very much think about the future and what we would call oversight. And I suggest you come to the oversight panel tomorrow to hear more about this. Thank you.
Thank you to you. How about, I've got one. Thank you very much. How about interdisciplinary research? What's your opinion? Could it contribute to resilient nuclear waste management?
Well, yes, definitely. I think from what we talked about now, there are three main points that I'd like to highlight. I mean, of course, there are many more of them, and we will hear about many of those during the next few days. But to me, it is really important. I think that we need to look at nuclear waste management, not at this single issue, but really look at the boundaries of where it interconnects with other topics that we have to deal with in the future, where there are interrelations, where there also may be contradictions in dealing with those different topics, and for example, in the use of the underground, or also others where we can learn from other systems, other problems, how we deal with them, and really see it as part of the baggage that we have to deal with to allow for a good future, and not as this single thing that we're carrying forward. And the second point is that we really, as Claudio before said, this term of safety, what does it mean? And I think really need to open the debate on the many different aspects that contribute to safety, not only technical aspects, but also organizational aspects, and time as a safety aspects, and all those different aspects and how they interrelate, how they correlate, how they interact, and what in the end then for us now can mean safety, and how do we carry this forward. And the third one is that, well, coming back to this term of resilience, I think we need to debate on what the basic functions are that we really need to preserve. And for this, and I'm coming back to the point of taking decisions, before we take a decision, I think we really have to see that we also offer an opportunity for so-called minority positions to be acknowledged, to be debated, and then when we take the decision also to really make it comprehensible and transparent how and why this decision was taken, how minorities' positions were, how did they contribute, and why were they maybe put aside. And in this way, I think interdisciplinary research can really contribute and offer knowledge for good governance, for decision-making that is transparent and comprehensible, and also for coming to indicators or to criteria for when we really have to change the system and the nuclear waste management approach that we're taking at the moment.
Thank you. Jan-Henrik Meyer, would you please continue?
Yeah, I have a number of thoughts. One is really continuing on my thoughts on democracy and the resilience of nuclear waste. I think there's plenty of areas that need to be explored there. Sort of theoretically, what are the logics at play? Sort of what are the interests that actors have, and what is also the feedback functions that democracy ensures, and what are and that also means looking at the experience of different democratic countries in waste management with this specific perspective on resilience, and really how have they dealt with this short-term and this long-term issue, and with the problem of nuclear waste being a bad rather than a good. And then I think it's useful to also explore sort of the two sets of actors that are in this play, really the experts, their limitations of knowledge, that also with a view to working with scenarios, sort of what are the blind spots, what are sort of also the blind spots that are there because it's convenient, but also because it's part of the frame of mind. This has a lot to do with the debates on experts more generally, but also in terms of interests and knowledge. It's really what happens to resilience if we are dealing with actors who have an interest in not being transparent, in not wanting to have appropriate information, who want to downplay this, or maybe also for reasons of getting to a decision, but also maybe of getting to a decision that's more convenient for them. So these merchants of doubts problem, I think, is very important. And then I think it's in a world where you have more right-wing governments, where you have less, where you also have dictatorships that produce a lot of new nuclear technology, how also at the international level, how do you deal with this problem of governments where all these feedback functions don't work? I think that is important. And finally, juxtaposing these resilience problems of nuclear waste governments to experiences on other environmental problems, say on the climate change issue. I think that's almost, that there are so many similarities of postponing problems into the future that this is actually worth exploring and very helpful and useful to explore.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I would
Claudio Pescatore as well.
I must say that your last sentence would be my first one, that is raise the conscience that we have a problem to solve. If you do not have this conscience, I mean, the things will stay as they are. And it's a difficult one, so it does deserve research. It seems another one that Sophie rose is that we should not see this in a sustainable development context. We cannot see nuclear waste as an isolated issue, because there is other issues as well. So when you have to deal with concepts like safety and also funding, I mean, you have to look at it more holistically, and perhaps having separate administrations. Like one is nuclear administration, the other one would be an environmental administration, another one would be, I don't know, mining administration. It's not very good. It's not very good. Same practice will lead to different safety issues, if you like, even if they're compatible practices. And then, of course, there is the active social research is useful to organize the decision making. Is social scientists to understand how the countries functions at a specific time. So we need input from these people to help in decision making.
Thank you very much. I'm, as I said before, guardian of our time schedule. and it's already 11:05, so we've already had 2 very intensive hours. Coffee is ready, I've been informed, tea as well. Other drinks maybe later or in the evening. Thank you very much for all of you, for your questions. Just a very question, where will we see you again in the next 3 days? Do you have any recommendations, or where will we see you again?
I suggest you come to the oversight panel discussion tomorrow, because it is about the long term.
First advice. Second?
Second advice is, of course, shameless self-advertising. We will present the results of the project on nuclear information and debate in the 1970s and 80s tomorrow. And I'll definitely be interested in the intergenerational justice issue.
Sounds very attractive. And Frau Kuppler, what's your suggestion? Oh, both of you.
I have 2 suggestions. Choose the topics which you think will question your baselines, what you think is normal. So I think that is a very good starting point for the research process. And the second one, don't forget the posters. We have, I think, very interesting and many interesting posters from various fields. So don't forget them. We have a few rooms full of them.
Oh, now.
Well, I have a quite similar answer. I think it's great. This is such an interdisciplinary conference, and I'd like to kind of encourage everyone to go and go to sessions that are not from your discipline and ask as many questions as you can and interact, and this way go forward with resilient knowledge making.
Thank you. That was really unrestricted advertisement. Excellent. We'll all see you again. Thanks for your applause. And there is it's yours. And there is a very final remark by my esteemed colleague, Claudio. He's one of the masterminds of organizing this event, by the way, and he's some further instructions for you.
Okay. No mastermind thought, just some few words. So first of all, not to make you too angry, but we want to keep really coffee break to 11:20. So we ask everybody to be at the lecture halls at 11:20, and in particular the chairs for the next 4 sessions. We have 2 very tight sessions here in Moscow and the same in Ashgabat. Please take your coffee here, make yourself familiar with the rooms and with the techniques and the directors and assistants and so on. That's very important. Some technical remarks about the curtains. Please don't move them by hand. We have some switches at the walls which should be used, and since this building is really old, also don't move any, this is particular for the workshop organizers, don't move tables just by pushing them, and don't step on the grids. That are some important things, otherwise we get really into difficulties with the owner of the Café Moscow. And finally, so at the end of the day, we have a closing remarks, and the people who take part should meet together with me and Christoph Hamann here in the last coffee break at 4:40 p.m., I think, and some other announcements which are important will be made tomorrow. Now enjoy a coffee break, and we meet in roughly 11 minutes.